Free societies are rare in history, and lasting free societies are very rare. The global menace of authoritarianism is the world's number one menace. 2026, because of the challenge to think, could be America's last best hope of the last best hope.
This is the City of God podcast, where Christ meets culture. America at 250. That's the topic of today's conversation with Os Guinness, a globally recognized author and social critic who spent decades thinking about faith, freedom, and the future of the American experiment. You can listen to this episode of the City of God on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. Or you can watch on YouTube or by going to crm.tv. Now, let's welcome Os Guinness to the City of God. So good to see you and have you on the City of God podcast.
Pleasure to be back.
Os, I've so enjoyed reading your booklet entitled The 250th Anniversary of the Revolution. You always have incredible insights, telling the true story of America and kind of what is at stake in our 250th anniversary of American independence. And so I want to know from your perspective, are we headed towards renewal or decline? And why is this, regardless, such a pivotal moment in our nation's history?
Well, I think only the Lord could tell us which way we're headed. But why is it so important? 250 years is an achievement because free societies are rare in history and lasting free societies are very rare. But the Roman Republic was twice as long. Now, if you take Egypt, from which Israel was freed, millennia. Chinese dynasties, millennia. 250 years is not very long. My college this year is 700. But the framers set up something that is a freedom like no other. And I would argue that, if it's recovered today, is the world's only counter to the global menace of authoritarianism. Because you can think in the West of postmodernism, Nietzsche, my world is the will to power and nothing beside. And the growth of Eurasia with Putin in the West, Xi Jinping in the East. The global menace of authoritarianism is the world's number one menace. AI bringing us post-humanity, authoritarianism bringing us inhumanity. How do we counter it? The American Republic, properly understood, is a freedom like no other. That's why it's important, but America has drifted a long way.
As you often talk about the phrase that we hear in almost every presidential State of the Union address, that the State of the Union is strong. And you like to, rightfully so, kind of challenge not only the statement or the conclusion, but actually how do we measure the strength of the Union? Mm-hmm. By what measure and by what standard should we, particularly as Christians, judge the strength of a nation?
Well, this year you had even President Trump going further. This is the golden age of America. Now, I think we have a wonderful opportunity because 1776 is the baseline. And now we have this year as the benchmark. So you look at 250 years. Mostly Americans aren't too good at history. You remember the great quip of Mark Twain that war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. Well, Americans need to think historically. What was it the framers set up? You take MAGA, Make America Great Again. Nobody goes on to say, what made America great in the first place? I ask people and they mumble something about, well, it was Jewish and Christian principles, biblical. Yes, there were, but what were they? They've been lost, almost every one of them. So at the dinner, I want to go on and say what actually were some of the principles. And we, as followers of Jesus, need to go back and be the champions of those. And we shouldn't just critique the darkness and lament and be outraged. We've got to live the alternative. So this is an incredible opportunity. You remember 1863, Lincoln said America was the last best hope of Earth. I truly believe, humanly speaking, underline the humanly speaking, 2026, because of the challenge to think, could be America's the last best hope of the last best hope.
Every nation along those lines, empire, kingdom, has defined success differently. Could be great political success, military success, economic flourishing. What would be, for the Christian in particular, what would be the markers? What could be the things we look at in society, both now and in the future, to say this is truly a healthy nation?
Well, put another way, look biblically. It's very interesting that when Adam, right at the beginning, is sentenced to mortality, it's the first time he sees Eve, who's just a woman up till then, as the mother of all life. The secret of longevity and immortality is children. Whereas most pagan empires and most secular empires go for monumentalism. Build the Parthenon, build the Colosseum, build the pyramids. They always go for monumentalism, names on buildings and all that. No. The Bible would say ultimately the secret of immortality is in heaven. But proximately, it's actually children. And so if America wants to survive, it won't be great militarily. You know, the Jews often say their national motto, not by might, nor by power, but by my spirit. And so if we think that armies and the economy can do it, we'll be disappointed. They will fail. It's actually that spirit of freedom rooted in faith that alone will keep America lasting.
I want to go back to something you said, because I think you're right on, and I try to ask this question a lot as well. What made America great in the first place? Can you speak to how Protestant Christianity in particular shaped the West and how it shaped ultimately the Republic?
The early church, when it became the official religion of Rome, copied Roman structures. What did Rome have? A Caesar, consuls, senators. And what did the church have? Pope, cardinals, bishops. In other words, hierarchy, power, ranking. And that was actually the most famous saying on power. All power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Lord Acton. He was critiquing, as a Catholic layman, his own church. He did not believe in papal infallibility. Now, the Reformation came, of course, sola scriptura, back to the Bible. Was hierarchy the way of the Bible? No. The biblical politics is covenantal. So Exodus and the renewal of Exodus in Deuteronomy is covenantal. The founding of God's nation is covenantal, and that was rediscovered in the Reformation. Calvin, Zwingli, Bullinger, Knox, and so on. So the Mayflower Compact is a covenant. John Winthrop on the Arbella talking about covenant, and he was called an American Nehemiah. John Adams, second president, he says the Jews have done more to civilize humanity than any other race of people. What was it? It was the ideas of the covenant. So the Declaration of Independence talks about the consent of the governed. Where does that come from? Exodus. The Lord proposes the covenant. 3 times the people say, all that the Lord says, we will do. The Sinai covenant is very unique. The Lord is a partner. Not under him, he's a partner. And it's with the whole people, not with Moses. Moses represents them on Mount Sinai at certain points. It's with the whole people. They all sign on. And it covers the whole of life. Now that is covenantal politics. And we need as Christians to go back to re-explore that. You know, again and again, Rob, I don't know about here, I'm sure it's not the same with you. People are asked about politics, Christians, and they say, yes, well, we need to discuss Romans 13 and Revelation 13. And they begin and end with the New Testament. The early church was under a dictatorship. They had no room to move. Politics comes from Exodus. And we need to explore these again and realize we are the guardians of the greatest expressions of freedom and justice. And the early founders had that too. And we need to go back to that. So I argue 2026 should be a massive American homecoming. Back to the Lord, back to truth, back to reality, back to the first principles. So we can't just say MAGA. We got to say what those principles were and are, and then live them out today.
Yeah, that's so helpful, so important. Another topic you've written extensively about, and it's along the same lines of what we're discussing, is the difference between the Revolution of 1776 and the Revolution of 1789. Both, at least on the surface, fighting for the same thing, but their values and their understanding of where independence and rights come from drastically different. Talk to our audience about how two revolutions happening at the same time, separated by a decade and a few years, could have such drastic outcomes.
Well, there's a whole number of differences. Let me just mention some of the simple and obvious ones. The American Revolution is principally rooted in the scriptures. The French Revolution is rooted in the French Enlightenment, Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, and so on. Out of that become very important differences. For example, their view of humanity. The American Revolution, being biblical, is realistic. Humans are fallible. We all go wrong. We do wrong, we go wrong because of the fall. The French Revolution's utopian. Rousseau, man is born free, everywhere in chains. Remove a chain or two, and somehow we'll all be wonderfully naturally free. Rubbish. When you follow utopianism, there's always a gap between reality and the ideal. How do you fill that gap in the French Revolution or the Chinese Revolution? With coercion. You've got to make people what you want them to be. Coercion. And all the utopian revolutions of the left have been murderers. So Marxism has killed more than 100 million people. And part of it is that gap between the ideal and the real. You just got to force people to be what you want them to be. And go on down the line like that. The current big difference is justice. Now, both the left and Christians, we do care about injustice. But the biblical view is quite different. For the left, you set up a conflict of powers. It's all a struggle of power. But at the end of the day, how are you going to ever get peace? Well, the only peace you'll have is you've got a power so powerful it can squelch all other powers. And that's what the Romans called the peace of despotism. And that's where all the left-wing revolutions end. So they begin with a passion for justice. All credit to them. We care about it too. The biblical view is quite different. Quite different. And so we need to go down the line. Because always in Scripture, Moses, to begin with, you set up the choices people have. And ask, life and death, choose life. Lincoln did that. A house divided can't stand. America can't be half slave, half free. You've got to choose. And today, America can't be half 1776 and half 1789. You've got to choose. But call it wokeism. It's much more than just one word. But people really have to choose. Now, Moses and Lincoln were not only great leaders, they were teachers of their nations. That's what we miss today. So the present administration does things not with persuasion, not with principle, just power. We need a leader after President Biden, after President Trump, who will understand the republic and call the nation back in terms of principle, but with persuasion, and set up a choice people can make.
Let's kind of expound upon that a little bit, because you do talk often, and I really do appreciate when you talk about the longing and the need in our republic for a Lincoln-like leader. He was a teacher, but what else was it about Lincoln that we need so desperately now in our republic?
Well, he really understood the Declaration, and he saw it as the American promise. And all his thinking, as he often said time after time, came from the Declaration. So, for example, the very obvious thing of slavery is the America's original sin. All men are created equal, but not the slaves. So in the 18th century, you had people like Samuel Johnson, the creator of the first dictionary, saying, come on, why is it, to quote Johnson, those who are yelping about freedom are, as he put it, the drivers of Negroes. There's a huge contradiction there. Lincoln understood that. The Declaration means, in Lincoln's terms, liberty for all. And you read his thinking. He really believed in the Declaration, and he saw the logical consequences of it, and he fought at incredible cost. So that's why he was such a great teacher. He really knew the American Republic. And people like that have been so rare. President Reagan was like that. You go back to his speeches with General Electric, and as president, you see he understood, often in very simple, homey, wonderful ways, what America was about. That's what we need. It isn't just greatness. America didn't become great because of the military. Didn't become great because of the economy. America's a nation by intention and by ideas, and Americans need to know what they are and live them out again today.
Oz, I want to go back to this idea of the Christian influence in shaping the American Republic. And I think people can get confused because some people might hear that and go, I thought that's what our founders were fighting against. They didn't want the monarch to say that he or she is the defender of the faith or promoting the true religion. I thought there was freedom of religion. So how do you reconcile for our audience, those that maybe get caught up in maybe attacked for their faith and expressing it in the public square? How do we reconcile this principle of freedom of religion on the one hand, but the reality that Christianity played such a predominant role in shaping America?
Well, I've been arguing the Christian faith rooted in Judaism.
Yeah.
So it's the Jewish and Christian faiths. But today we're attacked, say, Christian nationalism. I make a clear distinction between patriotism and nationalism. So every human being needs four very simple things: relationships, meaning, belonging, and purpose. And a good human life, you have to have all of those together. The second one, or the third one rather, is the important one in this case: belonging. We all belong somewhere. And patriotism is the particular love for the place that people belonged to. Patriotism is good. Even George Orwell, the atheist, said patriotism is good, nationalism is dangerous. Why? Because nationalism is the place I belong to, right or wrong. And in biblical terms, that becomes an idol. And you can look at European history and see the nationalisms became truly murderous. Now, part of the dislike of nationalism today is the fact that many people on the liberal side are internationalists. They believe in globalism and that sort of thing. So they scorn nations. Nations are very important, but we should be patriots and avoid an idolatrous nationalism. So that's one thing. Another one would be the separation of church and state and so on. Another thing that we need to clear up. Because clearly religious freedom was pioneered by Christians. Roger Williams and people like that. And it was freedom from state control of the individual conscience and so on. These things are terribly important, but we need to think them through in ways that are positive today.
So thinking about today, although on the one hand, there was a desire to not have an established state religion, but But on the other hand, they made it very clear, First Amendment in the Bill of Rights, the free exercise of religion would be a foundational freedom for a flourishing republic. Why does that need to remain, particularly for the people of God, a foundational freedom worth fighting for in our 250th anniversary of independence?
Because nothing is deeper than our conviction about what the world is and what is ultimately valuable, which is our worldview and our worship. And that's more important than even speech. So freedom of speech is very, very important. But that conviction that allows the heart and mind to come to your own conclusions about what life is about and what's ultimately the most worthwhile thing in life that I will give my ultimate allegiance to, that's what freedom of religion and conscience is all about. It is the first liberty, both logically and historically, and we need to keep it that.
You often talk about turning the world upside down. As we approach the events and the festivities of July 4th and all of those that'll happen before and after, what are practical things that Christians can do every day to help turn this world upside down?
We remember that's the criticism that was leveled against the Apostle Paul. These men who've turned the world upside down have come to Athens. Now, that was a huge part of the English Revolution. In other words, the idea was very simple. God creates order. Sin brings disorder and chaos. So the Lord works in a disordered, fallen world, and he's turning it upside down in order to turn it the right way up. So our Jewish friends, they talk about tikkun olam, the repair and restoration of the world. We as believers go a little beyond that. It needs a truly understood I don't use the words tritely as cliches. No. The gospel is turning the world upside down in order to turn it the right way up. And it's our privilege to be bearers of the gospel, to see that in some small way in our lifetime, in our world. So I love that. Because the fact is, I don't know where you want to begin. Take freedom, human dignity, or even sanctity of life. You go on down the line. Or one that I'm very strong on today is civility. That's a Roman word. The idea is biblical. Why? You have a respect for people, and you have a respect for truth. There's two things in the Old Testament the Jews have that I absolutely love. They have a notion of what's called evil speech, which is tantamount to murder and blasphemy. They have another notion, argument on behalf of heaven, or argument not on behalf of heaven. Argument on behalf of heaven is when you're arguing for truth. An argument not on behalf of heaven is when you're arguing just to win, victory, power. When you argue for truth and you win, both sides win, because the truth is established. When you argue only for power and you put someone down, you win, both sides lose. These things are profound because American speech, public discourse, is disgraceful. From the White House down, much of the speech now is worthy of a locker room. Now, I find American public speech, take the F word, tediously boring the way some people use that. American speech, the insults of the president of his enemies, these are disgraceful by biblical standards. And the biblical idea is when words break down, violence is never far away. And words have broken down. Words have become trivialized by advertising. You're selling, simple little things with incredible images and words. But then words have been weaponized by politics. So American discourse is disgraceful. And you remember Jacques Ellul many years ago, those who want to reform humanity must begin with the reformation of the word. Now you think we as Jews and Christians, in the beginning, the word. How did God create the world? In a word. Words create worlds. Words after the fall can destroy words. We are the guardians of words. So when Christians join the insults and all that, we're letting our Lord down.
And we certainly are existing in a society that has no concept of civility, and we're certainly paying the price for it. Yeah, you've made a striking claim that the greatest enemy to freedom is freedom itself. What do you mean by that?
Well, freedom, misunderstood, becomes liberty running into license. Or freedom requires both the structures of freedom and the spirit of freedom. But people don't think about the spirit, they only think about the structures, eventually lose both. Or people love freedom so much they'll do anything to fight for their freedom, including things that contradict their freedom. But the worst of all is freedom requires responsibility. And people don't like responsibility. And so it looks as if there's a tyranny in freedom. If I'm free, I'll have to be responsible for that. No. And then it looks as if there's a freedom in tyranny. And that's why psychologists say there is an appeal of authoritarianism. There was a famous incident recently of a Soviet woman who came to America for freedom. And then with all the chaos, she wanted to go back. And someone asked her, "You mean you're going to lose American freedom?" And she said, excuse the language, to heck with freedom, she said, "I want peace." So freedom has the challenges, and that's the main reason freedom never lasts. Freedom is so easily undermined by itself.
I'm just curious, as we think about the current age that we're in. You know, some people call it a secular age, some people call it a post-secular age, post-Christian age. I'm just curious, when you look at American society specifically, how would you define the age that we're in? Because I do think it's important to understand what we're up against as we continue to fight for the freedoms that, as you said, made America great in the first place.
Well, Rob, I would expand the discussion, because we're towards the end of 500 years of the assaults on the Christian faith, beginning with the wars of religion, the division of the faith. And we face secularism, the rise of the so-called godless self-gods, which is Heine's description of Karl Marx. Then you have secularization, which is the way that the modern world with business, science, technology, and all this makes faith marginal and meaningless. And most of life just operates without it, because we're not thinking about how faith is really primary in business, science, technology, and all areas of life. That's secularization. Faith becomes privately engaging, publicly irrelevant. But then the third great factor, acculturation. You look at the lost 10 tribes of Israel. They weren't exterminated like Hitler in the Holocaust. They were acculturated into oblivion. We'd call it today worldliness. They became like the Assyrians. They were lost, the majority of Israel. Much of the church has been acculturated in oblivion since the Enlightenment. So I happen to be Anglican. The Church of England, and even more the Episcopal Church here, has lost the plot. It's lost the faith. It's acculturated in oblivion. There's no distinction between it and the thinking of the modern liberal progressive world. So we're now facing a tremendous challenge. I put it in David and Goliath terms. Can faith prevail against modernity? Of course we'd say yes. We've got to show it. Because clearly much of evangelicalism is beginning to go the way of the mainline too. We have given in church growth movement, celebrity culture, and increasingly politicization. And many people who are, as you and I, we want to be involved in politics. Very important. We must be involved in politics. But it's the kingdom first and politics second. So the polarization between a privatized faith and a politicized faith where politics is really dominant. That's terrible. So we need to have a reformation. And by God's grace, faith must prevail over modernity and not modernity over faith. Should be simple. The word like David's pebble.
Amen.
But it's not that simple.
Oz, final question. Celebrations and festivities have always been an important part of God and his people celebrating his work and his providential hand and in leading them and bringing about flourishing and freedom. And you're in the 250th celebration here in America. You're going to be involved in a number of activities and events and festivities. What should the people of God, how should we be celebrating that we would be able to look back at this year and say, this was a celebration that honored the Lord and a celebration that was worthy of the great American experiment?
Well, you and I are going to be together at the National Day of Prayer on May the 7th. And I've been part of a group thinking about that. It must have three elements. Thanksgiving, giving the Lord thanks for all the incredible blessings of freedom and many other things this country's enjoyed. Secondly, confession. No airbrushing of history. You know, the Bible never airbrushes heroes. The greatest king? David, a murderer and adulterer. And he's forgiven, but there's no airbrushing. And America cannot airbrush what's gone wrong. And we need to say, like Moses, like Lincoln, like Solzhenitsyn, we have forgotten God and the results. But thirdly, rededication. That's the genius of Nehemiah. The lost 10 tribes were acculturated into oblivion. And you can see at the time of Nehemiah, that was the tendency of those who were there. But he brings the covenant and the Torah, and he literally saves Judaism. And of course, that's the story of revival. So I think thanksgiving, confession, rededication, but beyond that, prayer for revival. Now, we've seen in America local revivals, say at Asbury College, but we need a nationwide revival. We need a Western-wide revival. We need to see the Western church joining hands with the global church all around the world to really stand together against the menace of authoritarianism. You know, I love that great saying of G.K. Chesterton, surveying the times when the church was in trouble. And he said, 6 times the church has gone to the dogs. But in each case, it was the dog that died. Because we don't believe in decline and fall. Yes, that happens. We believe in exile and return. Now, I believe, Rob, too many Christians quote 2 Chronicles 7:14 unthinkingly. While those are the words of the Lord, if my people and so on, I will heal their land. Solomon didn't do it. He disobeyed what kings were supposed to do in terms of the gods of other countries and women and so on. And what he did, he became a Hebrew pharaoh. And so the language you see in Exodus, in Egypt, is used at the time of Solomon. He had slaves who were foreigners and Israelites as conscripts building his, and you know he took twice as long to build his own palace as he took to build the temple. And it was under his son that the kingdom was divided. People didn't want that. I think we need to go back to Moses and the prophets right through to Malachi. And Moses, the first one to say, if you return to me, says the Lord, I will return to you. And that's what America needs, a homecoming. We need to come back to the Lord and as followers of Jesus to stand for the great biblical principles and live them out today. So it's time to stop just crying against the darkness. Yes, there are things that are outrageous, things that are sad, that reduce us to tears or to anger, but we've got to show the alternative, tell the better story, and live it out. This is an incredible moment we must not miss.
That's a good word. We need a revival that leads to reformation. Oz, so good to have you on the City of God podcast. Appreciate your friendship and your partnership in this kingdom work.
Thank you. Always my privilege.
What a fascinating conversation with Oz. If you enjoyed it as much as I did, would you leave us a 5-star review? It helps more people discover this very episode. And while you're at it, share it with a family member or a friend. You can keep up to date with me and Coral Ridge Ministries throughout the week by following us on social media. Subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss an episode. This City of God podcast is produced by Coral Ridge Ministries and made in partnership with the Institute for Faith and Culture. This is the City of God podcast, where Christ meets culture.